I've received some requests to make a video on musical articulations, and I've been thinking a lot about the best way to do this. I'll split this topic into two videos. First, I'll discuss the most common Western European classical articulations, and I'll show when and why I might choose certain articulations over others in my music. Then, in part 2, I'll discuss strategies and effective ways to use articulations when working with sample libraries. Adding articulations to your composition is extremely important because it helps your performers interpret and shape the music and bring life to the notes and rhythms. Using a variety of articulations can unlock a new set of sounds and timbres, but unless you're a classical instrumentalist, you may not realize that articulations are often a bit subjective and open for interpretation. When two different concert performers see this symbol, for instance, they may have two slightly different interpretations, and how they perform the passage may differ. It can be disconcerting to many composers, especially beginning composers, when a performer plays an articulation or even dynamic or tempo different from what the composer had in mind. I think we can learn two things here. One, the composer writing for musicians should specify as little or as much information as they need. If a composer is upset over an interpretation of their music, I would say most of the time it's because the composer wasn't clear enough. And so the second thing a composer could learn is that one of the beauties of working with musicians is that the musician has the ability to make the music their own and interpret it as they like. That means adjusting tempos, dynamics, phrasing, and of course, specific to the topic of this video, the exact nature of articulation. It's a tough thing for composers to learn, and like I said, if you as the composer absolutely need to have, for instance, the length of a particular note be exactly what's in your head, then you should figure out how to specify that in the score. There are a few different categories of musical symbols that I'd like to discuss in this video. I'll start with the basics. These are articulations that can be played regardless of instrument or musical style. To achieve a smoothly connected musical line, you want to indicate legato technique, which is almost always done using slurs. Without slurs, each note in this measure would be articulated with a slight separation between notes. With slurs, the instrumentalist or vocalist will play the connected notes without separation and articulation. For singers and wind and brass players, this means playing each note within the same breath. And for strings, that means each note within the same bow stroke. For certain instruments like percussion and piano, legato articulation can still be indicated, and the instrumentalist will do what they can to connect the notes. Next, we have two different short articulations. Staccatos are short and separated, and the performer will usually stop the end of the sound more abruptly than on a normal note. So as an instrumentalist, I would usually play this measure slightly differently than this one. How a performer plays the measure with eighth notes is entirely dependent on tempo, as the eighth note's duration would obviously be different in fast versus slow tempos, whereas the staccatos aren't as tempo dependent, and they simply mean short and separated. Staccatissimo are even shorter and more separated than staccatos. You might actually want to use a shorter note duration, like this, to reinforce the staccatissimo articulation. Accents indicate that the note should be played louder with a stronger attack than normal, and marcatos are usually even stronger and louder than regular accents. Tenuto is probably the most difficult articulation to define, as it can be interpreted several different ways, depending on who you ask. Most performers will play a note with tenuto marking at full value, so there is very little separation between adjacent notes. Also, some performers will add a little emphasis to these notes in comparison to unmarked normal notes. The majority of these standard articulations can also be combined. Notes with tenutos underneath a slur indicates that each note be stressed individually under one breath or one bow stroke. This is most common with string instruments where the performer can separate each note but use the same bow direction. It's also common to either start a legato phrase with an accent, which makes the first note stronger than the rest, or to end a legato phrase with a staccato, which makes the last note shorter. You can combine staccatos with accents to indicate a louder short note, or accents with tenutos to indicate a louder note with full duration, or even staccatos with tenutos, which may seem confusing as staccatos and tenutos are somewhat contradictory, This ends up sounding similar to portatos, basically slightly stressed and longer but clearly separated from note to note. There are also a number of musical ornaments and temporal symbols that can add character to your music. Probably the most common ornament is the trill. Trills can be notated several ways by simply using the trill symbol here, which means trill to the next note above that's in the key signature. I recommend, however, using either of these notation styles so that the performer knows exactly which note to trill to. And for trill intervals larger than a second, I recommend using this notation, which is technically a tremolo notation, not a trill, but they sound the same. Other ornaments include mordents, turns, and grace notes. These are just a few of the possible ornamental symbols, and they were much more common in the Baroque era. It's fairly rare to see mordents and turns in new music today, but grace notes are still quite common. Grace notes marked without the slash are called appoggiaturas, and the performer will emphasize the grace note on the strong beat. Acconciaturas, on the other hand, are unstressed and performed before the strong beat. So normally the performer would borrow time from the previous measure. Next we have a few temporal markings, meaning markings in the score that adjust tempo or pause time. These aren't really articulations, but I thought I'd mention them anyway. Fermatas can be placed over notes, rests, or bar lines and indicate a hold or pause. When placed over notes, the note is held for a longer duration, for however long the performer or conductor feels appropriate. The fermata marking can also be accompanied by text indicating short, long, or very long. Breath marks appear after notes or rests and usually indicate a short pause, just long enough to take a breath. Caesuras appear just before or over the bar line and indicate a complete pause of metric time. Normally, fermatas at the end of a measure would be held for a time, and the music would then continue into the next measure. But often you'll see caesuras right after fermatas, which indicates a hold and then a full stop of metric time. So all of the articulations and markings that I've mentioned thus far can be used basically regardless of the instrument that you're writing for. I've left out some of the less common articulations as well as quite a few non-classical music articulations. There are other articulations and performance techniques that are specific to certain instruments, like string instruments or percussion instruments or wind instruments. I'll probably make an entire video on these types of markings, so I won't go into too much detail here now. But just to demonstrate the vast number of performance techniques, here's a list of just some of the more common string techniques. I've organized these into left hand, right hand, and extended techniques. This is far from a complete list, especially in the extended techniques category. So for this video, I wrote a few short melodies and gave the written music to a violinist to play and record. Here's the first melody, a slow lyrical melody in C major. You'll notice that there are no articulations or slurs notated, so the violinist had only the notes, rhythms, tempo, and dynamic marking to instruct in this first read-through. Because there are no slurs, the performer would likely change bow direction on each note. That's called a détaché bowing. The equivalent for wind and brass players would be to re-articulate each note so that you hear the attack each time. Professional string players have the ability to make détaché bowing sound extremely lyrical and connected, so even without slurs, string players are capable of smooth, connected melodies. So here's the violinist sight reading this melody without any notated articulations. So the first change that I'll make is to add slurs to try and achieve a smoother, more lyrical sound. Knowing where to add slurs isn't always easy, especially if you're not a string player. The most important thing to consider is the dynamic level. The louder the dynamics, the more bow the player will need to use, and thus the more bow changes or slurs that you'll need to add. After dynamics, you'll want to consider the phrasing and motivic structure of your music. So you could add one slur over the entire phrase like this, but even at a piano dynamic marking, the violinist would likely run out of bow and make at least one change at some point. Leaving the decision up to the performer is okay, but in an orchestra section with many violinists, You'll want them to use the same bowings, so unless they have time to work that out themselves, it's best to notate something that is playable. So you could divide the phrase in half, perhaps like this, so that the bow change coincides with the leap up to a higher string. You also might want to look at motives or gestures throughout the melody to make sure that any repetitions get the same bowing. In this melody, I might want to have the same bowing here, here, and here at the end as well. So I'll try and group similar sized gestures together throughout the rest of the melody, like this. Another option here would be to have portados. I'm showing portados over the entire melody here, which is a bit extreme. In reality, I might only choose to use this type of bowing over a particular moment or gesture, for instance, just this figure. But for the sake of the demonstration, I had the violinist play this entire melody with portado bowings. You could also indicate portamentos to achieve a more expressive, romantic sound. Like portados, I might try to find just one or two places in this melody to use portamentos, but again, for the sake of the demonstration, I notated many of them and gave it to the violinist to read through. You can have portamentos either underneath a slur or coinciding with a bow change, and the two notes don't have to be on the same string, so it's not the same as a true glissando. Another bow technique would be flautando, which in my opinion works really well at low dynamics and in combination with détaché bowing. The technique makes the timbre a bit warmer and more flute-like, hence the term flautando. So for this more lyrical, expressive, low dynamic melody, I think those are a few great options for articulations and bow techniques. I wrote a second melody, this one a bit more lively, in order to demonstrate how certain articulations and techniques work better in certain styles and contexts. Once again, I gave the violinist this music without articulations to see how they would read through it. Let's hear what that sounded like. So without slurs or any articulation on the notes, like staccatos or tenutos or accents, the violinist played détaché bowing, and you can hear that the notes feel connected, but you can also hear the bow changes on each note. The term détaché here indicates that the bow stays on the strings, which makes the eighth notes sound just a bit heavy. If you wanted a lighter sound, you could add staccato markings on the eighth notes. Because of the tempo and dynamic marking, the violinist would see staccatos here and likely play the notes off the string, meaning a lighter timbre and bouncier sound, though not quite as bouncy as spiccatos, which is the technique used primarily for faster staccato passages. I discussed the various temporal markings earlier in this video, and I think adding fermatas in this melody on these two Cs might be worth trying. Because the rest of the melody has a very obvious pulse, finding a moment here or there to temporarily abandon that pulse could be an interesting choice. For the second half of this melody, you might choose to have these double stop notes be all down bows. Down bows are slightly more accented than up bows, and when you notate the down bows like this, the player will emphasize these notes. Normally, each new bowing alternates the bow direction, so you have to notate specifically the down bow marking if under normal circumstances the note would be an up bow. So the last bit of music that I gave to the violinist was a 2-measure ostinato type gesture with fast 16th notes. Without any articulation notated, the violinist will play the notes on the string, which will result in a more connected, slightly heavier sound. If I were to add staccatos, the violinist would separate the notes more clearly. And if the tempo were even faster, the violinist might use spiccatos, or even sautier bowings. You, as the composer, just need to indicate the staccato markings, and it's usually up to the performer then to figure out what technique to use. I could rewrite the rhythms here and then ask for tremolo bowings. Well, technically the number of slashes indicates the number of divisions of each note. Usually when you write 3 slashes, that indicates an unmeasured tremolo. In other words, the player will bow and repeat the note as fast as possible. I could also rewrite this passage to use ricochet bowing, which is a skipping, bounce-like bow technique indicated with staccatos underneath a slur. Here's what that would sound like. So obviously there are a ton of other techniques and articulations to choose from. I'll be sure to discuss when and why you might want to use each one in upcoming videos. Stay tuned for my next video, where I'll discuss using articulations in sample libraries effectively. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.